Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, one of the best-selling games of all time, and for very good reason. It has some of the best drivers, karts, and most importantly tracks in the entire series. With 48 tracks upon release, it already had the most tracks out of any Mario Kart game. Then came the Booster Course Pass, which completely changed the game, doubling the number of courses to a staggering 96 tracks, far and away the most out of any Mario Kart game if you don't count Mario Kart Tour. With so many tracks in the game now, and since 8 Deluxe is a game I've loved playing for years now, I figured that I'd go ahead and make my own ranking of all the tracks in the game. I'll be ranking these tracks based off of their design, visuals, music, and just how fun they are to play in general. We have a lot of tracks to cover today, so let's go! 96. GBA's Sky Garden. Yeah, this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. Sky Garden is absolutely awful. The original Sky Garden is one of the best tracks in the series, so I was really excited to see it come back in Tour. So, how good was it?
It's just an ordinary crabby... Oh my goodness! Squidward!
I tried, Mr. Plankton.
All you need to do is look at the course maps side by side to see what a downgrade this is. It's so simple now. There's like 6 turns now and none of them flow well at all. There are a couple of shortcuts that aren't even worth mentioning, and there's no anti-gravity either, despite how easy it would have been to put at this last part with the steep incline. Not to mention that this track somehow looks worse than it did in Tour. This redstone road does not look good at all. At least the music is still really good, but everything else is so bad that this doesn't really help its case. This course is now missing all life, personality, and any sort of challenge. You can make an argument for a couple other tracks in the game being the worst, but I don't think you could find a bigger downgrade for a retro track no matter how hard you tried. 95. 3DS Toad Circuit, what I'm pretty sure most of you expected to be at the bottom of the list. This is the track that near single-handedly destroyed all hype for the Booster Course Pass. Toad Circuit is one of the worst possible tracks that they could have chosen for Wave 1. The layout is extremely boring, and they didn't even try to do anything to try and spice the track up with an anti-gravity section or an underwater section or something like that. It also doesn't help one bit that this track is probably the ugliest in the whole game. This yellow-green concrete is supposed to be grass? Really? I mean, even when you drive in the grass, it still doesn't look one bit like grass. This track is awful, there's no other word for it. The music is okay, but everything else is bottom of the barrel. The DLC has gotten much better, for the most part, as it has gone along, but man, did it ever have a rough start. 94. Bone Dry Dunes, the worst track from the base game. This course looks bland even for a desert course. The music isn't bad, but it isn't really memorable either, and the course design itself is the absolute worst. Most of it is just dull, but this middle section is a whole nother story. It takes some serious skill to not slam into the wall in these turns, even on 150cc. The last section with the sand geyser and all the dry bones running around is kind of cool, but it doesn't really fix the issues that this track has. This course is a mess, and it's one I never look forward to having to play. 93. Ice Ice Outpost. This course is really baffling to me. Nothing on this track coheres together well at all. Despite the name and background, this track has little to do with ice. For most of the race, you're having to pick between these green and yellow roads that are really poorly laid out and also have a surprisingly low visual quality considering this is a base game track. It's really similar to most of the Wave 1 DLC tracks. The only thing on this track that has anything to do with ice are the 4 shortcuts that you can take, all of which suck. They all require extremely precise driving to not fall off the track and just make this track even more annoying to play. This track is simultaneously really dull and insanely irritating, and I would be really happy if I never had to play it again. 92. Tour Tokyo Blur, the first and worst in the long line of Tour City tracks. This was just the second city track to be added to Tour, and boy does it show. The idea of changing the route on each of these 3 laps on the Tour tracks is really cool, and it's executed brilliantly on later tracks that they added. However, for Tokyo Blur, this feature doesn't really do much. There's a couple of thwomps ready to crush you on laps 2 and 3, but aside from them, you are literally driving on a smooth highway the entire time until right before the finish. No dash panels, no trick ramps, no tight turns, nothing. It's also super bland visually, but that's honestly a bit of a given for the Wave 1 tracks, isn't it? Most of what you see is something you would actually see if you went to Tokyo, such as the Rainbow Bridge and the
Kaminarimon.
Cactus, but the layout is so forgettable that the references don't really matter at all, and it all contributes to a really dull track that earns the title of being the worst tour track in the game. 91. Tour Paris Promenade. I find it amazing that Nintendo really decided to put the 2 worst city tracks from Tour in the Booster Course Pass right up front. Obviously, they were going for the save the best for last approach, which is fine in theory, but I know many people who stopped trying to play the city tracks altogether because of how bad Tokyo and Paris are. Like Tokyo, this track is so boring and forgettable. Aside from the Eiffel Tower, there really isn't much that stands out visually. And aside from the gliding sections, there isn't much that is different from Tokyo gameplay-wise. The course is so wide at every single point, and there's very little challenge anywhere on this track. The only part that's even remotely cool is the section on the 3rd lap, where it's kind of like Luigi's Circuit from Double Dash, and you're going back across the pack in the opposite direction of the other players. That's kind of cool, but again, it doesn't really do much. The only reason this course gets the nod over Tokyo is because it looks just a little bit better, but again, that isn't really saying much. 90. GBA Cheeseland. While this one definitely got a massive facelift from its original iteration, that doesn't mean this track is any good. This track looks and feels like a generic desert track, not really having much to do with cheese at all. And the only things here that remind you that this is, in fact, cheese are really, really annoying. These holes in the ground are really cumbersome to drive around and can easily send you flying off course if you don't trick off of them properly. Also, seeing as this does look a lot like a desert, Nintendo made it canon that it is really hot at this course. And what does cheese do when it melts? It gets slippery, which is, of course, what happens here. This course has a really low level of traction, which becomes even more problematic when combined with the aforementioned holes. Add in the absolutely broken mushroom shortcuts off to the sides of the track, and you have a course that is just not fun to play, online or otherwise. 89. GBA Sunset, in air quotes, Wilds. Imagine being so dumb that you take out the main mechanic of a track that made it a fan favorite in the first place. Sunset Wilds as a whole is not bad. The layout is simpler than it once was, but honestly I kinda like that. The music slaps and the Shy Guys are adorable as usual. However, the main gimmick of the original GBA track was that every lap, the sun progressively got lower and lower in the sky, all the way until it was nighttime on the final lap. This has not happened on another track before or since, and it really made this track stand out. Yet for some reason, that doesn't happen in this remake, and I don't get why. I've heard some people suggest that this is because they aren't able to turn the skybox in 8's engine, but I'm calling BS on that. You know why? Because they had no problem doing this in Tour! Tour! A mobile phone game! You mean to tell me that my phone can do something that my Switch can't? Give me a break. Nothing else about this track matters if the sunset isn't there. This track is so disappointing, but it didn't have to be. 88. Wii Daisy Circuit. I hated this track in Wii, I hated it in Tour, and I somehow hate it even more now. This course is fine visually, the statues are cool as always, and it has okay music. However, the layout is just as nonsensical and lame as it was back in Wii. The sidewalks are still annoying to drive on, and most of the turns are so wide that there's no challenge at all. The only changes they made were adding a glider to the shortcut, and adding a ramp here for some reason, and also adding dash panels at the next to last turn, which, spoiler alert, are slower than just driving as close to the inside curb as you can. All of this would probably make this a C-tier track, however, this course gets worse when you realize what could have been. This mid-tier starter course somehow made it into the final wave over fan favorites like Airship Fortress, the Woohoo tracks from 7, Luigi's Mansion, Delfino Square, Toad's Factory, and many, many more deserving tracks. Its inclusion makes about as much sense as Peachette does as a character, which is to say, none.
And also, Peachette.
'87 SNES Donut Plains 3. There aren't many SNES courses in this game, but honestly, I'm okay with that, seeing as there isn't really much you can do to spice up the SNES courses.
You sure about that? You sure about that?
Hello there.
Anyway, Donut Plains 3 isn't very good. The layout is just really bland and doesn't do much to spice things up over the original. You can go in the water now and you can trick off the Monty Mole holes, but again, it doesn't really do much for a track that is so simple otherwise. Also, the road towards the end is really slick, which makes the ending more annoying than it has to be. '86 Excite Bike Arena. A lot of people are fans of this track. I am not one of them. The Excite Bike references are really cool, but this track is just basically Baby Park, but long and annoying. Combos that are fast on other tracks take too long to land from the big jumps, meaning that whenever I get this track online, I sink down into the pack, making this track really, really unfun to play. Maybe I would like this course more if it were more fun to play online, but I don't know, man. I get why a lot of people love this track, but honestly, I don't think I ever will. '85 Mario Circuit. The track designed to look like the logo. This track is nothing more than a figure 8 that folds back over onto itself, making it so that the track feels a lot more complex than it actually is. There are some piranha plants to avoid, some jumps, a glider, and most of the track is anti-gravity. It's simple, but it works. It's just okay. There really isn't much more I can say about it. '84 N64 Toad's Turnpike. I really don't know if this track is better or worse than the original. On the better side, you can drive on the walls now, trick off of these surfboard cars, glide off these trucks, and the course looks beautiful overall. On the other hand, this course is now so easy. The OG course was insanely hard, with cars that moved insanely fast, took up most of the road, and had deceivingly small hitboxes that made them feel like more of a challenge. Here, though, you can easily avoid every single car with little effort, which makes the course a lot more boring in my opinion. '83 SNES Mario Circuit 3. I don't know why Nintendo is obsessed with bringing this particular course back. This is now this track's 5th appearance in a Mario Kart game, tied with the SNES Rainbow Road for the most appearances in the series. Yet this track isn't really memorable at all. It's just your typical basic starter track. Solid to drive on, but the visuals of this one are pretty lazy. The layout, as I said, is solid though, and that's enough to counteract that fact and make this course just okay instead of really bad. '82 Hyrule Circuit. I know a lot of people will be mad at this, but I'm just not a huge fan of this one. The coins being replaced with rupees is a really cool detail, as are the piranha plants being replaced with Deku Babas. The track also looks stunning. However, yet again, the layout is really disappointing. These stairs are really bumpy and annoying to drive down, and this forest section at the end is just really tight and awkward to maneuver through. There isn't really much else to talk about with regards to the layout either. I mean, this course is really just a glorified figure 8 with a dent in it. The only thing worth noting is this Triforce shortcut, which I always seem to be in the wrong position to take, so it really doesn't do much for me anyway. It's a decent track and it's memorable, I just don't like it very much. '81 Tour Amsterdam Drift. This track is a noticeable step up from the previous city tracks, but again, that isn't really saying much. You go through a grassland with a giant windmill on lap 1, a harbor on lap 2, and a flowery meadow on lap 3. The track also looks pretty decent for city track standards. However, the layout doesn't really flow all that well, and the music is surprisingly boring and unmemorable, which is really a shock considering how good the music in 8 is overall. I wasn't really a fan of this track in Tour, and I'm still not a fan of it now. 80, GBA Mario Circuit. Yet another simple, basic starter track. Really fun to race on, but not all that memorable. The only thing that's really great about this track is the fact that they implement anti-gravity in maybe the most creative way in the whole game. Throwing it back to the old Ultra Hand toys to raise up the track at this one part for an anti-gravity section is a really cool idea. Also, as a NASCAR fan, the idea of having a pit road off to the side right next to the start-finish line has always made me way happier than it has any right to. Aside from that though, it's just a really basic starter track. Nothing bad about it, but nothing all too great to make it stand out. 79, Mario Kart Stadium. Yet another basic starter track, only this time it actually kind of has a reason to be. It's the first course in the game, meaning this track is tasked with showing off what this game has to offer. The anti-gravity section is simple yet effective, and gliding off it towards the crowd at the end is really cool. The nighttime aesthetic is also beautiful. At the end of the day though, the layout is really simple without much challenge at all, and it gets outshined by many other tracks in the game. Still though, this track is solid, and it's one of the best starter courses in the entire series. 78, Tour Sky High Sunday. This track is basically just a more interesting version of Excitebike Arena. There are multiple paths, a glider section, and the entire track was done in anti-gravity. Also, the music is absolutely insane for an ice cream themed track. This track technically debuted in this game before it did in Tour, but anyone who says that this is not a Tour track is just lying to themselves. How do I know this? Well, first of all, the track doesn't really look that great visually. Everyone jokes that this looks like Fortnite or Fall Guys, and honestly, I have to agree. The colors are really oversaturated and kind of get draining on the eyes after a while. Also, the layout of this track doesn't really suit this game very well. It's really easy to fall off the inside of the track at each of the 2 turns, which makes sense since this track was made for a game with auto tricking and forced smart steering. Also, these guardrails being turned into anti-grav spinners makes no sense at all, and both looks and feels like a really lazy inclusion. This track is decent, but there are a lot of problems that make it really the worst non-city track from Tour. 77, Water Park. This track is the definition of just okay. The setting is really cool, and they put a lot of effort into the background, and the course looks really good. Also, this is one of the less annoying water-themed courses in all of Mario Kart, so it has that at least. Unfortunately, once again, the layout is super basic, it's really wide and really easy, and doesn't really offer much in terms of replayability. It's a fun track, there's nothing wrong with it, but again, there are many other courses that top it, hence why it's more towards the bottom of the list. 76, Tour London Loop. Yet another Tour city track. This one does a pretty good job of incorporating a lot of London's famous landmarks, such as London Bridge, Big Ben, and Buckingham Palace. Once again though, the layout of the course is really bland and doesn't flow very well either. There aren't many obstacles to avoid, the only ones that I can recall are these boxes, some barrels, and these chain chomps, which aren't really difficult to avoid on laps 1 or 2. They do break free and start running around on lap 3, which is pretty cool, but they still aren't really that hard to avoid. Aside from that, this track is really just another version of Tokyo that, at the very least, looks and drives way better. 75, Tour New York Minute. Oh look!
Another one.
This track does look pretty good for a Tour track since it takes place at night, and the layout flows surprisingly well for a city track. However, it is still a very basic track, which in this case does make sense since this was the very first city track to be released in Tour all the way back in 2019. However, I've always found it confusing that they name this track New York Minute, which is a term made as a reference to New York City's infamous traffic, yet there are no moving cars on this track at all. Weird, especially considering the track based on Berlin, a city not famous for traffic jams, does have moving cars on it. Weird. Still a decent track, it just could have and really should have been a lot better. 74, Tour LA Laps. This track has always just really confused me. Most of the city tracks do a pretty good job of incorporating most of the area's famous landmarks into them, but LA Laps completely dropped the ball on that front. Instead of including, Hollywood, a Hollywood sign, amusement parks, or the La Brea Tar Pits, they instead chose to include the Santa Monica Pier, Dodger Stadium, Beverly Hills, and the Inglewood Oil Field? What? At least the first three make sense for LA, but the oil field both makes zero sense and, on top of that, is extremely annoying to drive through. Also, the music in this version takes out the a cappella baz that the tour version had, which makes the song much, much worse in my opinion. If the rest of the track wasn't at least a little bit fun, this track would be much lower on this list. 73, Electrodrome. I get why a lot of people like this track, but once again, I don't. The atmosphere is, for lack of a better word, electric. This track looks beautiful, and the techno effect when you're driving before the split paths is really, really cool. But aside from that though, the layout is really basic, and this downstairs turn at the end is really, really annoying. And the track doesn't really do much for me otherwise. I'm just not really a fan of this one. 72, Shy Guy Falls. Just like Excite Bike Arena and Electrodrome, this is a fan favorite track that I just really don't like. Driving up the waterfall is a really cool idea, and the Shy Guys making noises in time with the song is really kind of adorable. For some reason though, I just don't really like playing this track. It could be because of how many people pick this track online, and I'm just kind of sick of it. Maybe over time this track will grow on me like a couple of other tracks have, but for now I'm just not a fan. 71, Tour Bangkok Rush. Aside from taking place in the city with the greatest name I've ever heard, this is probably the most complex tour city track design-wise. Unfortunately, that's a bad thing in this case. There are multiple different paths to take at nearly every section, giving the player a ton of options to create their own route. The problem is that most of these options don't really work well with 8's physics engine. You have to be really precise to be able to trick off of the boats and the ramps without flying off into the walls. You can tell that this is a track that works pretty well in Tour, where smart steering is mandatory, but not on a console. This track is fun, it's just a little too complicated, and I don't really enjoy it. 70, Tour Ninja Hideaway. This is a tour track that I thought would be incredible in 8, but it just doesn't work. The theming and visuals are amazing, and all of the different paths are viable for going fast and fun to create your own adventure on, but this track was clearly designed for you to have smart steering turned on. You have to be really, really careful to not just fly off the track if you want to take a corner fast, seeing as there are so many ramps on turns with no walls on the outside. I still really like this track, but I totally understand the many people who absolutely hate this track, and honestly, I can't say I really blame them. 69, DS Nice Ridge. I always used to like this track as a kid, and I still do now. This track reminds me of a nice family road trip through the mountains near my hometown. Unfortunately, this track also suffers from Wave 1 syndrome. Next to nothing has been changed about this course, aside from adding a wind turret you can trick off of near the end of the track, and a glider ramp in the grass towards the middle. Oh, wait, did I say grass? Excuse me, I meant concrete. Seeing as it, along with pretty much everything else on this track, has no texturing whatsoever and looks like garbage on a console. It's still a fun track to drive on, but it has basically nothing else going on, and the visuals very nearly bump this one down to C tier for me. It should be a lot better than it is, but hey, that's Wave 1 for you. 68, Sweet Sweet Canyon, aka Wreck-It Ralph, the track. This is one of the more basic OG tracks in this game. Driving through a candy-filled wonderland sounds really fun, and I don't know, it kind of is. This track uses gliding, underwater driving, and anti-gravity very well, and nothing really overstays its welcome. The music is nice, and the visuals are okay as well. However, the layout is still kind of basic, and there are many other better options to choose from in this game. 67, GameCube Dry Dry Desert. This track was one of my favorites to goof around on with friends in Double Dash, and while the two main goof-off mechanics, those being the tornado and the giant piranha head, have been removed, the driving itself has been improved greatly, and the addition of the Oasis at the end is a really fun addition that improves on the original. I also like the addition of the pillars that fall as you progress through the race. It makes this track feel a bit more like Dry Dry Ruins from Mario Kart Wii, which is one of the best desert tracks ever made. This track is still really fun, and it's one of the best desert tracks in the series. I just wish they had left the fun, quirky little mechanics in this track in the remake. 66, DS Cheep Cheep Beach. I grew up with Mario Kart DS, and this was the first track in the game that I really liked when I first played it. So, seeing it return took me back to when I was a little kid. This is a simple, peaceful track with a really nice, calming song. The colors are very vibrant, and everything looks and plays very nicely. The only change they made to the track itself was to add a glider ramp off the pier, which is a great change in my opinion. However, that wasn't all that changed. Seeing as underwater driving is now a thing, you don't actually have to avoid the water as the tide rises and falls anymore. Personally, I actually liked it better when you had to do that, as it added a bit of a challenge to an already pretty easy track. However, removing that turned this track into one of the easiest courses ever. So it's definitely not as good as the original. 65, Dragon Driftway. It's funny how such a creative track could be so forgettable. This track takes place on a Gobblegut-themed Chinese dojo and has plenty of engaging twists and turns. Also, I really like the Kung Fu Lakitu posters, they're a really creative touch. As a whole though, this track is so simple layout-wise that it feels like it goes by in a flash, and I tend to forget that this track exists after I play it. It looks good and drives well, there's just nothing that stands out in a game with so many amazing tracks. 64, Wee Moo Moo Meadows. Honestly, I used to really hate the updated visuals of this track as a kid. I used to really like how bright and colorful the original was, and hated this remake as a result.
Your intellect is as weak as your dollar. Failure is your destiny. You disrespect yourself and your nation. You are made of stupid.
Apparently I was, since I realize now that this is so much better. The grass and road look much better now, and the morning sky is beautiful. It fits the theme of a farm so well, and is much better than the original taking place in the middle of the day. This track is still essentially a circle, and I can't really put it much higher than that because of this fact, but I don't think I will ever not enjoy this track again. 63, Rainbow Road, aka 3DS Rainbow Road's disappointing little brother. With how insanely good the last two Rainbow Roads were before this game, I, and a lot of other people for that matter, could not wait to see what Nintendo did for the next iteration of this track, and, well...
My disappointment is immeasurable, and my day is ruined.
This track is so much lamer than it should be. Half the reason the 3DS version was so good was because of how it felt like the end of a journey rather than just a simple racetrack. And the reason the Wii one was so good was because it was insanely hard. making just completing a race feel like a huge challenge. This track, on the other hand, is extremely short, forcing a 3-lap count, and is really, really easy outside of the first 2 turns, which can only really get tricky if you boost at the wrong time. The music slaps and the track looks great, and it's still really fun, but with the high expectations that 3DS Rainbow Road gave future Rainbow Roads for the series, I expected much, much more. 62, Toad Harbor. San Francisco has never looked better. This track takes you through a city built on a steep hill, forcing you to dodge trams along the way. The downhill section at the end is obviously the best part. Rushing down via the dash panels or flying through the air are both so satisfying, especially when you're able to hit the ramp at just the right time and land on a tram, finding that you can actually trick off the top of it. The rest of the track is pretty forgettable, but the ending is so fun that I put this track a lot higher than I thought I would. 61, DS Mario Circuit. Fun fact, the DS version of this track is actually my favorite circuit track in the series. I found it to be much more fun and engaging than most of the other cookie-cutter circuit tracks, and this version actually improves on the course, making the fireballs an actual threat, adding a forest section with a wiggler that comes out on lap 3, and cleaning up the design to make it more fun to drive on. The only problem I have with this track is similar to Daisy Circuit in the fact that it was chosen over Airship Fortress and Luigi's Mansion, fellow tour tracks that would have been much more interesting and fun. 60, Twisted Mansion. Much like this game's Rainbow Road, Twisted Mansion is a remaster of a classic track idea, this time being Luigi's Mansion, that should have been so much better. There really isn't anything wrong with this track. The atmosphere and music are very spooky and memorable, and the track flows very well, making good use of all of 8's mechanics. However, unlike Luigi's Mansion, nothing about this track, specifically the location, is all that memorable. It's pretty much just the spooky version of Dragon Driftway. Good, but not spectacular, and thus rather forgettable. 59, Thwomp Ruins. The best Mushroom Cup track. I know, sad, right? The theme of this track is really unique, and the design is pretty fun. There are lots of thwomps and rolling wheels to avoid, some of which are pretty hard to do so. Thwomp Ruins is yet again just kind of forgettable, and I just don't have that much to say about it. I'm never angry to get this track online, yet never really that happy either. This really is one of the most forgettable Mushroom Cups in the entire series. 58, GBA Snowland. One of the greatest upgrades a retro track has ever gotten. The original Snowland was miserable. There wasn't really anything wrong with the design, but the road was bumpy, which meant that Nintendo thought it would be a good idea to have a shaking camera the entire race. Yeah, it's about as fun to drive on as you think it is. Here, though, the track takes place on a highway and thus is perfectly smooth, with no camera shake whatsoever. This allows the player to enjoy the gorgeous visuals, simple yet effective track design, and beautiful music without having to vomit afterwards. Nintendo did an incredible job of upgrading this track and turning it from forgettable and annoying to pretty great. 57, GameCube Sherbert-Land. One of my favorites from Double Dash. A lot of people really hate the original version of this track due to how slippery it is and how easy it is to turn yourself into an ice cube, but I actually kinda liked that. I found that it worked pretty well with Double Dash's slippery controls and found it to be a fun challenge overall. However, even I can admit that this track is much better. The track is not very slippery, especially for an ice track, and the visuals are, well, they're fantastic. I also like how they turned the breaks in the lake from death pits to underwater caves that you can now go through for an alternate route. Much like Cheep Cheep Beach though, it is incredibly easy now, and is thus a bit forgettable as well. 56, Animal Crossing. This has never really been a track I have liked at any point. Like Hyrule Circuit, the references in this track are really cool. Typical obstacles, coins, and items have been replaced with things ripped straight from Animal Crossing games. My main problem with this track has always been the simplicity of the layout. This is basically just another glorified figure 8 that neither flows well nor is very difficult. The track is also rather slippery, which doesn't really make sense considering we're driving on sand and dirt most of the time. It just doesn't work. The main reason this track ranks so much higher than I originally had it is because of the awesome seasons mechanic. There are 4 different versions of this track, one for each of the 4 seasons. The layout and obstacles don't change at all, but the music and visuals change drastically. No other Mario Kart has really ever done this, and this track does deserve props for that. 55, Tour Rome Avanti. I'll say one thing about this track, it is much better than I thought it would be in this game. I really thought this track would be a disaster considering how horrible it was in Tour, but they made some serious improvements here. The highlight, obviously, is the Colosseum, which you drive through on laps 1 and 3. 1 being through the top level, and 3 being on the bottom level, past a couple of chain chomps biting the road. While those short parts are really fun, the rest of the track is just kinda mid. The road doesn't really flow all that well, as is the norm with most of the city tracks, and there are a ton of tight corners located right after big jumps that make it really easy to fly into a wall. The music and visuals are also good, but most Tour City tracks can only be so good, and this one is definitely a good case for that. 54, Tour Vancouver Velocity. Case in point, here we have the biggest Tour disappointment in the game for me. Vancouver Velocity was the first Tour City track I actually liked, and I thought it would be fantastic in this game. And it is, for the first lap. This bridge through the forest that has become an anti-gravity section is so incredibly fun, and the long glide back into the city off of the bridge is extremely satisfying. After this, though, the track becomes extremely unmemorable. On lap 2, you go through a random park with nothing in it, and on lap 3, you go through a random road tunnel. Both laps have you going through Rogers Arena, which is very appropriate for a Canadian track, but nothing else about laps 2 or 3 stand out for me at all. Lap 3 is also insanely short, giving the track an even weaker ending. This track makes me wish we had the option to do races playing on the same variant of a city track on all 3 laps, but alas, we are stuck with a track whose fantastic beginning is overshadowed by its really mid-conclusion. 53, DS Peach Gardens. I used to hate this track as a kid, both on DS and Wii. The course was so annoying to drive through, and I always got hit by the chain chomps, mainly because I sucked, but we're not going to talk about that. When this track came back in 8, I figured I'd be able to enjoy it more than I once was able to, and I was correct in that assumption. Laps 1 and 2 are the same old Peach Gardens layout, just with wider paths and less jagged hedge edges. Lap 3, on the other hand, turns this track into one that is much better than the original. Instead of going the normal way, on lap 3 you make a hard left at the second turn and go back to the castle, going on to complete the final act backwards, where you can fly through the hedge sculptures, give Luigi a high five, and definitely not attempt and fail to fly through Peach's dress. This change breathes life into a track that I've always found really boring, and it makes it way better than any of its previous versions. 52, SNES Rainbow Road. Boy, did this track ever get a visual upgrade. This track is gorgeous to look at and so smooth to drive on, unlike the previous SNES courses, which each lacked one or both of these qualities. The thwomps also look and feel massive and are relatively hard to dodge, whereas in the past, they were no more than just an inconvenience. It's an iconic track, don't get me wrong, but the lack of anti-gravity or any sort of design upgrade is really disappointing, especially when you consider a certain other SNES course that we'll get to later. 51, Dolphin Shoals. I used to really not like this track, but over time I've come to appreciate it a whole lot more. The design of this track is extremely unique and engaging. From tricking on air pipes to tricking off a flippin' unagi and taking a glide that actually requires some skill to get right and not drive straight off the road, there is very little in this track that you can find anywhere else. The music also slaps and changes at each of the 4 sections of the track, which is a unique touch that only a few other courses actually have. It's a good-looking, fun track. It just still isn't really one of my favorites. 50. Tour Merry Mountain. Let's start off with the one major negative of this track. The layout is so simple here. Aside from one alternate path on some train tracks to the side, this track is basically just a squashed egg that is way too long and wide to be challenging at all. Now that that's out of the way, holy crap, this track looks amazing. The town at the starting line in particular actually looks like something you would find in the base game. I think that after the first two waves, and really the first 3/4 of the third wave, gave us almost nothing that looked good, this track made us all realize what was in the future for the Booster Course Pass. In one particular case, the immediate future. Tracks that both looked and played as good as tracks in the base game. Merry Mountain overall is really fun, and the anti-gravity being added to the giant hill at the end is such a good change. It's just a happy, cheery track that really doesn't have much wrong with it at all. 49. 3DS Music Park. Call me an idiot all you want, and honestly, that's completely justified in my opinion. Music Park is one of the most unique courses in the entire series. Driving across musical instruments, manipulating and changing the song as you do is an amazing concept that I wish more courses use. The course design flows well, the head-bopping piranha plants are a fun idea that would be taken to new heights a decade later, and it's a fun track to drive on. Honestly, I really couldn't tell you why I don't like this track. The only really big gripes that I have with this track are that the obstacles, particularly the aforementioned piranha plants and music notes, both have really awkward hitboxes that make it really easy to get hit. The only other gripe I have with this track is the lack of anti-gravity, which would have fit seamlessly into this track, especially on the xylophone parts. That isn't really much of a deal breaker for me though. Similar to Toad's Factory, Music Park is a legendary track that I think I was just bad at as a kid, which ruined my enjoyment of the track in the future. Who knows, maybe in the future I'll start to appreciate this track for the masterpiece that I know it is. Just at the moment, it just really doesn't work that well for me. Wow, that's a bit of a long one, isn't it? Numbers 96 through 49 had a couple of pretty decent courses on paper, but most of these were either really forgettable or had one or several major problems that make me just not like to play them. And then there are some Sky Gardens. Yeah. This is the conclusion of part 1 of this video for numbers 96 through 49. Next Sunday, I will be releasing numbers 48 through 1. Those will be some of my favorite tracks ever, so I'm really excited for that one, and I hope you guys tune in for the premiere. Anyways, this has been Turbo Kart 37. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day. See ya!